everyone. Thanks for joining us. It's great to have you here at this BCS Agile Methods event for June. Yes, we are still in June. Really glad to be doing this session with you all. I'm Seth Wilson. For those of you who don't know me, I'm the chair of BCS Agile. I'm joined by a number of my fellow committee members for this session this evening. We have Ahmad, he's treasurer. Give us a wave, Ahmad. David's here. David's our inclusion officer. Martin's around. He's our diversity officer. I've probably got his officer role on. Craig's here. And that's your supporting team for this evening. I'll hand over to Mike in a second. Just use your formalities, just basic code of conduct stuff. Just be cool to everyone, be respectful, and everyone have a good session, good time, good experience. After Mike's done, we will have time for questions. So if you can hold your questions till the end, that would be greatly appreciated. Feel free to drop them in the chat, and the team and I will pick them up. If you could prefix them with a Q, it makes it easier for us to spot them in amongst all the other, conversations that are going on. And if you do feel brave enough and want to verbally, pose your question to our speaker, then just raise the virtual hand. When we get to that point, we'll lead you in and you can ask away. So that's the plan. I'm delighted to welcome Mike to the PCS session. He's well known to many of the committees. He's been doing this stuff for quite some years. He's a household name. I've seen him speak many times. He spoke at my own meetup, Future Work Scotland. Numbers were talking about meeting him last year at Lean Agile London. Got very extensive experience and done some really groundbreaking work in Lean and Agile and Kanban. He's written a number of books. You'll probably remember his great classic Inside Kanban. I've got a copy of Agenda Shift here. I couldn't find. Can't see it because of the blurred screen, but that's only the first edition, though. You have to get the second edition.
Did you see that? No, I didn't.
So, yeah, and Mike's been doing amazing work in helping organisations with taking an outcome-driven, approach to change and transformation and strategy. That's how a lot of us know his work, and of course, he's the founder of Agenda Shift. And tonight he's going to be sharing a new talk with us, which I love the title of, is Between Spaces, Scopes and Scales, What the Scaling Frameworks Don't Tell You. And without further ado, over to you, Mick.
Well, thank you very much, Sath and Craig too, for that invitation. So between spaces, scopes and scales, what the scaling frameworks don't tell you. It's not quite a new talk. It's been going for a few weeks. Some people here have actually seen it before, but it's evolving quite rapidly. And in fact, there are people here actually even saw me do it as part of some training last week, and it'll have changed even slightly from then. What I'm doing here, I started with something quite detailed, and I'm iterating until it's something I can give as a keynote in October, deliver a 45-minute talk, reliably polished and everything else. So I'm really grateful for the chance to share it with you. And I'm really grateful for any feedback you may have on it afterwards as well, as part of the quick Q&A at the end, and I welcome hard questions as well as easy ones, especially the hard questions. They're the more interesting ones, or offline as well, whatever you like. So I'm going to skip over the books. Seth mentioned those already. You may have noticed I did a blog post this week talking about how to understand the leading with outcomes universe, as we could say. So most of what I've been doing for the last 3 or so years has been done under the umbrella of leading with outcomes, all based on Agenda Shift, but kind of expanding on it and looking at things from different directions. So Agenda Shift, a way of helping people engage with change, with transformation, help people engage with organization development, help people engage with Agile, with Lean. It's been used for all those kinds of reasons. As of about 2018, while I was writing Right to Left, it gained a metaphor, it gained wholehearted, just in one word, a way of understanding, well, what is it we're trying to achieve? We would love organizations that were more whole, where there was ownership of what made our organizations unwhole, where there's that sort of heart, that energy and so on that comes from people innovating from inside the organization. And then sort of sneaking in between those And this is more recent. This was just really started in the second edition of the Agenda Shift book, and it's been my main focus really for the last couple of years, the deliberately adaptive organization. And what we're doing here is drawing on the theory over many decades now. We'll look at some of it today, decades from, going back to the middle of the last century, but also things much more recent that plug into it as well. Now, I'm going to skip over a slide about complexity, but that's something we might talk about in the Q&A. And you can get hold of the slides afterwards. You notice at the bottom of the slides, agendashift.com/keynotes. If you go there, even now, you can download a PDF of the slides if you want. So to get properly kicked off, I want to start with a couple of stories. And they're stories from my own career, 10 years apart, 1998 and 2008. One about a particular project I worked on, one about the whole organization. It was a bank. And we're going to use this little model, strategy, delivery, and assurance, to help us tell the model. And we're going to be paying attention to the relationships between those three things, between strategy, delivery, and assurance. Now, the project, 1998, an important year in my career. I led a small development team working for front office development in an investment bank. And we thought 1998 would be a great year to rewrite our P&L system, our accounting system, essentially. And why 1998 was an interesting year to do that? Because in 1st of January 1999, for the currencies that were joining the euro, their government bonds were going to be redenominated into the euro currency. Now, if you're a bank and you own literally billions of euros worth of these securities, that's actually quite a big deal. Now, this made this project actually a mission critical project, but we chose to do it that year because we weren't sure that the old system would handle it very well. Now, the strategy was an interesting one, and how the strategy related both to delivery and assurance. So in relation to delivery, we made a decision we were going to do everything we could possibly do to avoid a big bang implementation. It was like parallel runs and test runs and things like that. And then we, in terms of parallel running to live running, instrument by instrument, book by book, we slowly and carefully, and then more quickly as we gained confidence, switch things over to live, starting with the simplest instruments and then enabling the more complex instruments. We actually went live a couple of weeks ahead of schedule, which is fantastic. That was enabled not just by that strategy, but also the strategy of massively investing on the assurance side. There were more people testing what we were doing than there were people in my little development team. They vastly outnumbered us. And they weren't just QA professionals. And I'm not dismissing QA professionals, by the way, but these were experts from finance and from operations, drawn from the business, taken from their day jobs to make sure that this project was going to be a success, that we weren't going to end up with a catastrophic failure on our hands. Now, between assurance and delivery, perhaps my best afternoon's programming work of my whole programming career was making sure that all the data was available to that assurance team, that QA team, that testing team, in a self-service way, so that we could get on with our delivery, they could do their job, and we'd all work happily together. As I said, we went live early. The conversion weekend went well. The conversion event went well. And then eventually we rolled the same system out to other countries. I went to New York, to Zurich, to Tokyo, and so on, to implement this new P&L system. So it was good for me personally. I went on a little tour of the bank, in fact, to different divisions of the bank, so it was quite a big tour. But 10 years later, 2008, I find myself back in that very same department. I'm now an executive director, and I'm development manager globally for fixed income securities. Now, those of you that know your finance history, your banking history, will realize that 2008 was a very interesting year to be in charge of fixed income securities, even if only on the IT side. We're in the middle of the credit crisis. If you've watched the movie The Big Short, great film, very entertaining film, also very educational film. If you haven't seen it, go and see it. But UBS was like some of those firms in that film that faced catastrophe. they wrote down something like $50 billion worth of losses after their investments in fixed income in the US mortgage-backed securities, the things that went bad in the credit crisis. So what's the story there? They engage their strategy. For their strategy, they engaged McKinsey to do a benchmarking study for them. That's comparing the bank against their peers. I'll name the bank. It was UBS. They were very, in the end, upfront about what went wrong. They compared UBS against their peers, and the study came back and said, you should be investing in US mortgage-backed securities. This is goes back 2006, 2007, 2008. That strategy was strongly held and then enthusiastically delivered. In fact, over enthusiastically delivered. Figuratively speaking, even in Zurich, the Treasury Department in Zurich did the most un-Swiss of things. They sold their gold bars from under Bahnhofstrasse and they bought these mortgage-backed securities instead. I mean, catastrophically bad error of judgment there. And meanwhile, the assurance guys didn't have a chance. The strategy was too strongly held. The delivery was too enthusiastic, and they weren't listened to. The research arm of the bank was even telling our clients not to invest in this stuff. It's toxic, it's dangerous. And yet the bank itself did something nearly catastrophic. So two stories, two very different stories, a happy story and a story of near catastrophe, and this nice little model, strategy, delivery, and insurance. And if you know anything about agenda shift and the way that we get people to have dialogue, to explore things, ideal obstacles, outcomes, build strategy with those outcomes and so on, we can have those kinds of conversations with this kind of model. Just imagine every relationship in this little model helping its participants, those three things, strategy, delivery, assurance, towards their full potential. Every element contributing to the success of the whole. Well, you can imagine that. And then ideal obstacles, outcomes, a very agenda shifty thing to do. When that's working at its ideal best for us, what's that like? Whose needs would we be meeting? What new stories could we tell? That's the ideal part. And what stops that? What gets in the way? That's obstacles. What would we like to have happen? Then what happens? And many rich conversations we can have around outcomes from which we can start to organize some kind of strategy. But we can do better. We can do better. We've got a simple model that we can improve. It's actually a bit too generic. It's too bland. It's not quite opinionated enough, you could say. It describes both projects and organizations, and that's kind of a problem. What we want, what I wanted certainly, was a model that could describe viable organizations. A viable is a technical term here, but it means basically organizations that by design are improving their capacity for independent action in a changing environment. These are organizations that respond to change, that can survive and thrive, all those kinds of things. So what do we need to do to this model? Well, delivery becomes delivery, discovery, renewal. It's not enough to be delivering. We've got to be working out what we could and should be delivering, and we need to be renewing ourselves, building new capabilities, recruiting, maintaining, all those kinds of things, and guiding those and getting the balance between those things right. Adaptive strategy. And that's a bit more than just having strategy that can, move, take the rough with the smooth. This is strategy that's really about defending the existence of our organization. And when I say organization, I might mean a team, the whole organization, or something in between, something that cares about identity and values and mission and purpose. Not that those things are fixed, but they're usually pretty stable. And something very interesting is happening when those are open to challenge. But open to challenge, they need to be when the opportunity presents itself, or serious enough challenges impinge on us. An assurance that becomes mutual trust building. Organizations are built on trust. If you don't have trust, your organization might as well not exist. You might as well be trading between different entities. Organizations exist because it's easier to do business inside the organization than it is outside of them, and that is fundamentally based on trust. That's been known for years as an economics thing. And what the organizational theory did in the middle of the last century realized that information theory actually helps to explain the role of trust in organizations as well. It's a truly fundamental thing. We need to trust, but we need to build organizations that are trustworthy as well. So those three circles now, and I'm going to draw it slightly differently, 3 overlapping spaces. And why 3 overlapping spaces? They organize the detail of this model, the viable system model, defined by Stafford Beer in 1972, quite a long time ago. I was about to say middle of the last century. It's not quite as old as that, but it is actually slightly younger than me, I should say. So 2 books, Brain of the Firm, Heart of Enterprise, very famous books, respected books, describing how organizations work in terms of 5 or 6 systems and the relationships between them. So canonically, systems 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, and this odd one, system 3 star. The names in brackets, those are my names for them, not the official canonical names. Now, you will notice there's this quite complicated picture on the left. Now, it can get much more complicated and much messier than that. And to avoid that, and to avoid the challenge of, trying to explain something in those kinds of diagrammatic terms, the 3 spaces summarize the model until we actually need the details. So I call this the top view of the 3 spaces, but we can drill into those spaces to see the detail when we need it. And the real beauty of this is that we can provide a side view as well that reveals the relationships between scales, between organization scales, between team and team of teams, for example, between division and corporation. There are some fundamental things happening in those relationships that are very hard to see when you have that more sort of 2-dimensional structure. For structuring, translating, reconciling, connecting, quite abstract ideas, and to bring it to life, I'm going to borrow a model from my friend Klaus Leopold, flight levels. And we'll use flight levels to illustrate what can be happening. And we'll use it to illustrate some things that can go wrong. Structures that don't seem to fit, possibly a more common problem than you realize, the wrong things managed in the wrong places. Again, a common problem. Strategy is something that happens to you, not something that you participate in, not something that you have some ownership of. Disappointed customers, disappointed organization. Familiar enough problems, probably, but you may not realize just how deep-seated some of these problems are. And you may find that your efforts to fix them can be hard because the problems are actually much more structural than perhaps you realized. So very quickly, flight levels, and we'll start with a team. I'm representing the team here with a Kanban board, not because flight level needs Kanban, just because it's convenient. It's convenient to be able to see what's happening in the teams here. Teams that are sufficiently autonomous and cross-functional to be able to deliver value independently. That's not to say that they can't work together, and teams may form larger value streams. They can achieve with other teams what they couldn't achieve on their own. And I remember back to my banking days, I saw some amazing projects delivered by teams, just the teams talking to each other. But there comes a point when you need particular things to happen at a particular time or by a particular time. You need some level of higher level coordination. So above this flight level 1, this level of operations, this level of the work getting done, the value creating work getting done, we need a level of coordination. So we start things at the right time. We have the right sort of mix of work in the value streams. We can see that things are working well. We can look for improvement opportunities, development opportunities in our value streams, and so on. And above that, strategic portfolio management. Again, doing things that the teams on their own couldn't easily do. The teams on their own can't manage the overall mix of work across the organization and measure that against the risk appetite of the organization, for example. So those big kinds of questions do need to be managed at a high level. So that's flight level 3, strategic portfolio management. What we're going to do, we're going to look at how various problems that can manifest themselves basically anywhere on this picture, and understand what the theory says about what might be happening. So to the first one, and it's speaking to structuring, is we quite often see in organizations that a challenge emerges and it's not clear where in the organization that challenge should live. And this is actually ridiculously common, because in so many organizations, including organizations I've worked with, you've got basically two kinds of challenge, or two kinds of pieces of work. You've got small pieces of work that belong to teams, and you've got large pieces of work that belong at the top level in your portfolio of projects, and very little in between. And when a challenge arises that's somewhere in between, it's very hard to find a home for it, because the organization itself doesn't well describe how those challenges arise, where they come from. It's not a good model of its environment, to use the jargon. A little tool to help you, and this is from an agenda shift tool, the Outside In Strategy Review. And I've just quoted a little phrase from that tool and mashed it up with something from my friend Patrick Hoverstadt. So reaching the right customers, meeting their strategic needs, that's from the Outside In Strategy Review, along with some questions we use to help unpack it. Who are those customers? Where are those customers? What needs should we be meeting? And when do they have them? And in Patrick's scheme, that's customer, geography, technology, time. And to see how these work, these can you can use these in any order. You might not use all of them. You might use one of them multiple times or whatever, depending on the scale of the organization that you're talking about. But to illustrate it, I'm going to use our health service. I say our health service, the way the health services work in the UK. So customer, we'll start at the top of the customer. There are two kinds of customers as far as our health systems are concerned. Those who themselves or with their insurer pay for their own treatment, and those whose treatment is paid for by the NHS. And we have two very separate systems of healthcare based on that simple differentiation of the customer. Then where are those customers, or where are we in relation to our customers? Well, we've got people that come to our houses, to nurses and other practitioners who will come to our houses. We have local clinics. We have hospitals in our towns, hopefully, most of us. We have larger hospitals, teaching hospitals, and at national level, a few big centres of excellence. And what that geographical dimension is doing here is managing the tension between us wanting quick local access to health services and balancing that against the need to concentrate specialties, to concentrate capital equipment like scanners and things like that. So that's the geography dimension. And then technology. Well, technology in Patrick's scheme is really anything that meets a need, a tool, a product, a service. And you could think, for example, of the medical disciplines as being technologies, or the medical departments that correspond to those disciplines. So neurology, ophthalmology, whatever ology you might think of, corresponds to the technology dimension. Probably the most interesting dimension of all is time. And this will ring some bells with you if you're interested in job stories. And job stories as opposed to user stories. Job stories that tell a story of a need arising at a particular time in a struggling moment, as Bob Moesta calls it, out of which a solution helps us to make meaningful progress. That's a job story. But in our little NHS example, lots of ways we could use the time dimension. We could use fertility, maternity, postnatal, pediatric, general adult medicine, geriatric medicine, pathology, as a time dimension. Look at your A&E department. It's staffed by people that can't work 24 hours a day, but health needs arrive 24 hours a day, so people have to be arranged in shifts. And so that has an effect on team structure, on department structure. So all of these dimensions, customer, geography, technology, time, who, where, what, when, are ways of slicing up the world and making sure that your organization is a good answer to those questions. If you're familiar with team topologies, the chapter on domain-driven design also corresponds to these ideas. That's one of the best chapters in that book, I think. So that's structuring. Make sure that your organization helps you answer these questions. Who are your customers? Where are your customers? What needs should we be meeting? And when do they have them? Then to translating, I'm going to go to a much lower level, much more practical problem now. We're thinking about a piece of work. We're following the progress of that piece of work. And the challenge is, well, how do we represent that at that higher level? So if our work is going across our level 1, team level, value stream level boards, how do we represent it at the coordination level, or from the coordination level up to the strategic level? The first question to ask isn't how to represent it, is actually should we represent it, first of all. Not every piece needs to be represented at every level. And neither does every piece need to be represented by a sticky moving across another board. And the fundamental question to be asking is about means and ends. So when we're looking at what we're actually doing, that's the means. What are the ends that we are trying to meet? If we're talking in terms of job stories and user stories, it's the so that. We do this so that. Questions like, then what happens and why is that important? We can get more into the so that of the piece of work. And then we can think about measuring, our progress towards what it is we are trying to achieve, not just the progress of the work that we are doing. That's quite a different thing. We are measuring our progress towards means. And we can think of that in terms of measures of success, certainly, but even in terms of what are those basic indicators that tell us that we are beginning to make progress towards those ends. This is ends before means, outcomes before solutions, if you like. And if we're thinking about indicators as well as measures, indicators of progress as well as measures of success, we're getting to things like leading and lagging indicators as well. Now, why this is under the heading of translating, it's not just about translating progress. Our measures, there needs to be a level of translation as well. If all our measures at every level are the same, that's an indication that one of those levels isn't actually adding any value of its own. It doesn't have any objectives of its own. It doesn't have a strategy of its own. So that high level is just an aggregation of the parts underneath it, or it's just passing through the objectives from layers above, and so on and so on. If you're doing things like cascading OKRs, for example, those middle layers possibly not adding very much value of their own. If all your measures are the same, that's a bad smell. It tells you there's not enough strategic thinking happening. So one last thing about means and ends, it's a source of quite a number of dysfunctions, or it explains a lot of dysfunctions that we know by other names. So micromanagement, for example, is when someone who should be taking responsibility for ends is digging down into the means and trying to manage the means. And there are other failures as well. You might, for example, put the wrong side of the equation in, make them accountable for ends as well. You may make people at the lower level responsible for ends, for results, for outcomes at your level, things that they don't actually have enough influence, enough power over. That is setting people up for failure. So make sure across and up and down you can separate means and ends. Make sure you're measuring them or measuring progress towards them, and make sure that the right people are responsible for the right thing. That's translating. I'm going to get a bit more strategic now. How do we set some of these structures up? And reconciling. Now, reconciling is about making sure that things are coherent between neighbors, between levels, and so on. And I'm going to talk about dealing with surprise. Surprise, I chose the word surprise carefully. It used to say dealing with novelty, but surprise has an interesting relationship in the theory with information. If you're surprised, That is information. And what is the information that led to that surprise? So it might be, for example, that a piece of work wasn't accepted with delight by your customers. Why is that? That's surprising. We expected it to go well and the customer didn't like it. We expected that an improvement that we made isn't being adopted by our colleagues. Why is that? Our great idea for an improvement and no one's using it. Why is that? That's a surprise. Or a surprise might be a new piece of work coming from above, something that we need to respond to. So how do we deal with that? Well, first of all, we might just be able to adjust. We might take this in our stride. We can, without changing our commitments, this might be something we can accommodate. It might not even be that relevant. But this is something we can accommodate without having to replan, at least, beyond the day-to-day, beyond your stand-up meeting, for example. This is something that you can just deal with. It might be something significant enough that you need to share it with people outside of your scope. So with teams next to you, we had some assumptions about our customer that turned out not to be true. That affected us in this way. Maybe it'll have an effect for you in the things that you're building for that same customer. So share new information, or share information, upper level or down level, so that people have the information that they need in order to make good decisions. Next one, strategize. This is just about creating options. We've got this thing to respond to. How could we respond to it? We can generate some multiple ways of responding to it and start to think about, well, what is the best way? And part of choosing that best way is working out, well, what's the best way that makes sense for all of us, not just for us, but for those around us. And we've got a better idea of that. We can, restructure our plans, restructure our commitments, and organize around them. Now, if you're used to working at team level, if you're in a Scrum team, for example, this is actually normal. This is what teams are great at doing. I've started the process at a funny point with the surprise, but this is exactly what we do. This is responding to change, as the Agile Manifesto put it, self-organizing around new commitments. Where the trouble starts is that we are much less good at doing this at higher levels of organization. This is the results from a recent assessment I did, or the early results from a recent assessment I did, and more than half of the responses I got back, on a scale of 1 to 4, said that we were at the worst end of the scale, at the one end of the scale, at being able to restructure spontaneously in a self-organized way, even allowing for the fact that we collaborate with each other already. We are still really poor at recognizing that there is a need, there is an opportunity to reorganize. This is something that we need to get better at. That is reconciling, and there's like this stack of things that you can go through when you respond to novelty. You won't always need to go all the way down. Not every piece of new information is going to result in you, self-organizing anew. But at least make sure that you go down that list far enough. And particularly if you have any responsibility at higher levels of organization, make sure that you're doing this thoroughly enough. Now, fortunately, there is a way of recognizing when things aren't quite as they should be, when things aren't working as well as they could be. And that's part of the trust building process. That's part of the, if you're a manager of, walking the floor, managing by walking around, going to the Gemba and all of this. And this is where connecting comes from. This is about making sure that that's happening between levels of organization. Now I'm going to bring it home to something a bit more familiar to those of us who come from product development. And it's that nagging feeling that we don't have all the context we need to do a great job. Or worse, we finished a piece of work and found out only when the customer wasn't delighted that we didn't have all the context we needed to do a great job. Or perhaps we did satisfy the customer, but we made a decision that the organization isn't happy about. There was some strategic context or a policy thing that we didn't fully appreciate. So a little tool here, I say a little tool, it turns out into something that's so big you might wish I never told you. It's one of these things that you can't unsee once you've seen it. And that is to treat every vertical line here as a relationship. Now, I'm not saying you have to be using Kanban for this to work. Figuratively speaking, every vertical line here represents a relationship, not just between activities. We're not talking about handovers here, but the relationship between all the process that went before and all the process that goes after, and recognize that all of those relationships may be prone to a whole range of dysfunctions that I can summarize in these words. One side doing what might be better done by the other, or in collaboration, or deferred until needed. So too much design up front, for example, that's one side doing what might be better done by the other, or in collaboration, or deferred until needed. But there's a whole load of problems that can be explained in those terms. So what do you do about it? And here's a nice tool. So let's think about, across this relationship, should we coordinate, cooperate, or collaborate? So coordinate, do we just let the board do the work, and we can see what's going on just by what we're doing in our stand-up meetings, that's all we need to do. All our regular things that we do, or the inexpensive things that we do to coordinate with each other, that's going to be enough. Or for each piece of work, or for specific pieces of work, do we need to cooperate? Do we need to break it down a bit? Do we need to agree how and when we are going to synchronize, for example? Or perhaps that's not going to be enough. We need a deeper kind of relationship, a deeper collaboration. Our work, and still we don't know exactly how it's going to turn out, is going to be the fruit of a collaboration. Now, we can come up with what's an appropriate default for that relationship, but we can go a bit further than that. We can, at the beginning of the process, those of you that do, for example, the Three Amigos conversation, can actually make sure that instead of just the Three Amigos, product development QA are represented in that conversation at the beginning of the piece of work, that all those relationships are well represented. And that includes people perhaps from other levels that have the context that you need, the strategic context you need, the customer context that you need. And about that specific piece of work, do we coordinate, cooperate, collaborate, let the board do the piece of work, break it down and agree how to synchronize, or do we need to do something deeper? And at the end of the process, we can ask ourselves whether we made the right decisions, if we made a specific decision, and if we didn't make a specific decision, whether we have the right defaults. And if we did make a decision, whether we are good at spotting, is this something to coordinate over, to cooperate over, and to collaborate over? Fundamentally, this is a sense-making conversation. And when I say sense-making, there was a great correspondence here with Cynefin between coordinate, cooperate, collaborate, and clear, complicated, and complex, if you're familiar with the model. As for chaotic and that funny bit in the middle, if you can't agree whether to coordinate, cooperate, or collaborate, possibly you need to break this work down and try again, or you need to send some probes out, find a bit more, and then maybe you'll make a better decision when you're ready. Now, the thing about these relationships is that they're everywhere. Every vertical line in this picture is a relationship between halves of the process, the early half and the late half of the process, or between levels of organization. And it can get a lot messier than this. You may not thank me when you learn to be able to see this, but it's really helpful if you can actually understand, are we doing on one side of these relationships what might be better done on the other, or in collaboration, or deferred until it's really the right time to be doing this thing? Or across these relationships, are we adopting the wrong interaction style? Are we coordinating when we should be cooperating when we should be collaborating, or vice versa, in those other orders, in whichever combination is appropriate? I'm making this agenda shifty again, bringing in the dialogue, conversations in the language of outcomes, conversations that will help us develop an organizational strategy Let's imagine these relationships, all these relationships, not just the one in the model, but the actual relationships that are actually operating in your organization, in your process, in your structures. Imagine them ideally balanced in every respect, each relationship helping its participants achieve its full potential, every element contributing to the success of the whole, and then the ideal obstacles, outcomes thing. If this was working at its ideal best for us, what's that like? Whose needs will we be meeting? What new stories could they tell? And you can imagine your colleagues participating, enjoying that, thinking big, thinking how great it could be if we got that right. And then what stops that? What gets in the way? What are our obstacles, in other words? And then what is in store for us when we find a way over or through or around those obstacles? What would you like to have happen? Then what happens? Then what happens? Then what happens? Outcomes that we can explore with some more questions than those, outcomes that we can organize into strategy, outcomes that give us ideas of places to start and inspire us to find solutions, outcomes that lead to other outcomes and towards our goals. So to bring all that together, start where you are, from your scopes, wherever you are in your organization structure, in your process, whatever level you operate, at a scale that you understand, using all the opportunities those offer you, those afford you, structuring, translating, reconciling, connecting. Who, where, what, when. Means before, ends before means, outcomes. My maths isn't working. Ends before means, outcomes before solutions. And reconciling, seeing more of that self-organization happening at every scale, dealing with surprise a lot more carefully, a lot more robustly than perhaps you do at the moment. And for connecting, be a keeper of context. I'm not saying just, chip in with what you know. I mean, actually recognize when a piece of work is being done without the context it needs to be great. When decisions are being made without the information, without the context they need to be great, and wonder why that is. What was the conversation that didn't happen? What's the collaboration that didn't happen? Why are we keeping people insulated from the context that we need? And improving your processes, your organization structure, your role designs, and so on as a result. And then the fun starts. Well, the fun really starts when others around you are doing the same thing. Now, a few people throw their hands up in horror when I suggest it needs to be happening everywhere all at once, as my white paper describes it. But actually, it's so much harder to change anything when everything around you is static. Having these things happening around you actually makes the process so much easier. So start where you are, reach out to those around you, and work some of these things out together. So that's the talk. If you've been affected by any of the issues raised in this program, structures that don't seem to fit, the wrong things managed in the wrong places, strategy, something that happens to you, not something you're involved in, have some ownership of, disappointed customers, disappointed organization because you didn't have the context you needed, or go to agendashift.com/keynotes. You can get that PDF of the slides. There's a video of an older version of the talk there. I'll update that video as soon as this one is available. Some references you can follow up on, the assessment tool I mentioned, and various other goodies as well. Just quickly mention, I'm doing this again in person in Nottingham next week. Free webinar on the 11th of July, and then I'm not back until September. August I'm keeping clear. Another webinar, and then train the trainer. 4 afternoons in the middle of September. So just to finish with the keynote slide, go to agendashift.com/keynotes and get the stuff, look at the video, get the slides. Thank you very much. And I'm very happy to take questions, and I don't mind hard questions, as they're often the interesting ones.
Thanks, mate.
I'll stop sharing.
Agreed. I think we've got one already in the chat. That was great. Thank you for that. A lot to digest for everyone. We did already have a few queries about the recording. We will get that out to you through BCS channels as soon as it comes available.
Cool.
So all good. Question from Joe. I see a lot of teams truly believing they are collaborating when they are actually cooperating. Any tips?
So I suppose first of all, you actually need to define what you mean by collaboration, and you know, I see people and teams confusing themselves over this issue, and we even saw this a bit in our training last week. For me, collaboration, I think a really good example, a couple of good examples: Lennon and McCartney, Watson and Crick. You know, it wasn't that they liked each other, it wasn't that they were nice to each other, it wasn't that they keep telling each other what they were doing. You know, there was something deep and meaningful and especially creative in that process. Something came out of those relationships that wouldn't have happened if they were working independently. That wouldn't have happened if they were working with anybody else. So it's not about a style of who you are. It's not about a personality style. Oh, he's a collaborative kind of person. It's about the relationship and what we expect to come out of it. Another great example is the Wright brothers. They apparently had a really tempestuous relationship, but they still loved each other dearly. And you know, look at what they achieved. They got us off the ground. And, you know, within a few decades of the Wright brothers learning how to fly, you know, we were landing men on the moon. It is extraordinary. So that's what I mean by collaboration. And you've got to look at what actually comes out of it. You've got to look at the fruit of it. And it's not just working nicely together. I don't know if that answers your question, but that is what you need to be looking for, and that expectation needs to be there.
Yeah, no, that's really helpful. Thanks, Mike.
Yeah, actually, again, that Cynefin framework might be helpful as well. You know, if we all know what needs to be done, you know, you don't need a deep collaboration. If you can break it down to the point where you know what needs to be done, again, you may not need a deep collaboration. But it's in those other cases where no one quite knows how it will go. Where in those cases where you can't know how it's going to go until you actually try it, you know, until you actually get a response from your customer or a response from the organization, you know, you can never be sure until you actually try it. In those situations, collaboration is a lot more important. Yeah.
Great, thanks, Mike. Nothing else in the chat. Folks, feel free to raise your hand.
So there's a question just above that one. You might have missed it.
Is it? I missed it. Is it just? Is this the one from Tom?
Eric S.
This one from Tom there. How
Eric.
are you on metrics for objectives?
Well, I think Tom and I have had this conversation a few times, but I think outcomes and metrics, there's a lot of synergy between them. Some outcomes lead you to metrics. Some metrics lead you to outcomes. What I'm very keen on is that when somebody is working towards something, that it's meaningful. You know, they know what need is being met. They know whose struggle we are responding to. And those need to be understood, you know, before the solution is designed. And the metrics help us design better solutions. They will help, and it's important actually that the metrics help us identify and design better solutions, and they monitor our implementation of those solutions so we can see progress towards success as well as actually getting to success. These things, they are closely related. And I think the conversations we have around them are really important. And as you saw in this talk today, you know, there's even, you know, structural implications to them. That the fact that we need to be looking for different things at different levels of organization is really important. If you think about it, the kind of metrics you are looking at team level or at product level are quite different from the metrics that the board is looking at, that your accountants are looking at, you know, but there must be a connection between them. You know, somehow you must be able to get to what you're doing on the ground, to what the organization as a whole is achieving. And through those different layers of organization, that translating does need to be happening. There needs to be strategy at every level, and there need to be appropriate measures at every level, appropriate metrics at every level. And for those to be any good, you need to have some meaningful conversations. That's my answer.
I missed one as Ahmad pointed out, so I'm going to go back, see if I can find that one sec.
It was
Yeah,
Eric as well, wasn't there?
It was from Eric. Yeah, I got it. Really insightful, Mike. Thanks. Have you had any success landing your messages in public sector bodies?
A little bit, and to be fair, I'd actually say I will give quite a lot of credit to GDS, Government Digital Services. So I was interim delivery manager on 2 of the GDS exemplar projects. That's going back a bit, but that is in the some of the very exciting early days of Government Digital Services. I was delivery manager on Carers Allowance just before it went live, while we were in beta, and on Find an Apprenticeship as well. And they are really keen for it. Oh, if you remember them from those days, I haven't been that close to it in the last couple of years, but from those days, the mantra was start with needs, user needs, not government needs. And all that stuff about customer context, understanding who our customers are, where they are, what they're struggling with, when they have those struggles, all those kinds of user story and job story type questions. Those were really important to us, and making that meaningful, keeping that meaningful, having that motivate our work was actually super important. I wouldn't say we always had. I was going to say don't always have an easy relationship with the rest of the organisation doing those kinds of projects. That's actually not right and not fair. We actually had an unfair advantage in those exemplar projects. We had a get out of jail card. And we could wave the card when we needed to get something done. When the exemplar project's job was to show this is how we do things now. We could sometimes trample over other organizational sensitivities, you could say. But those basic things about understanding who our customers are, where they are, who they are, what their needs are, when they have those needs, all of that stuff taken very, very seriously. And they took the product side very seriously. They took the user research side seriously. And the digital services, which is a structural thing, we're organized into services. Those were there to respond to particular sets of needs. And I'm not aware that any particularly bad decisions were made in terms of how those were organized. So I'm just sort of mentally going through the list of 4 that I gave. So I've kind of covered structure and to an extent context. And I think those were done really well. How things rippled up through the higher levels of the organization, that was a bit harder for me to see. And we were kind of a special case as the exemplar projects, as I said. Thinking to the second one, we were already one digital service of multiple in one overall digital thing. So there was some structure there, and there were some related services that spoke to other parts of the ecosystem, could you say? I think again they got those about right. I have done work with 2 other government departments in the time since, not so much on this stuff, but more generally on the outcome stuff. I did a 2-day workshop at the DWP. That was just before COVID, and I did advise one other department sometime before then. I think the civil service is an interesting culture. It's a different culture to the corporate culture, but at the same time, actually very responsive. Sorry, to the user, to the customer. I think there are enough people that really care about outcomes in the civil service that actually this stuff does resonate. So I wouldn't give up hope. But if you want to get me in, I'd be delighted. Let's put it like that. I've never done it. One thing I'd like to say, I've never done any work for the health service, which is a shame because I'm a big user of the health service, or at least my family is. I'm the adoptive parent of a child with complex needs, so I see a lot of the NHS. I would love one day to actually to do some work with it. I have several family members who are work or have worked for the NHS, but I've never done any work actually in it. But that's interesting. I find the whole idea of public service is very, very interesting.
We've said it now, we've captured it. We'll get that out there. Somebody will respond to your offer, I'm sure. And there's one here from Plantic. Hopefully I'm pronouncing that correctly. Mike, awesome framework. Thanks for making it simple to understand. It's just about large IT transformations, divestitures and TSAs. I'm not sure what you mean by TSAs. How do you up the chances of success? They tend to be more black swans. What are the key pieces which have a high chance of going wrong?
Well, I mean, on transformation agenda shift, I mean, it's an overused phrase, but it's a paradigm shift. No, I'm going to, it's a bit of a caricature, but let's characterize the traditional approach to change. This is 1990s change management. And the sort of managed change model hasn't changed a lot since the 1990s, as far as I'm concerned. You know, it's choose a solution, sell the solution, perhaps using outcomes to sell the solution, roll the solution out, live with the consequences. Choose a solution, sell the solution, roll the solution out, live with the consequences. That's a pretty accurate, that's a depressingly accurate picture of too many big change initiatives. And what agenda shift does, it turns that completely around. Outcomes before solutions. And we're engaging people at multiple levels of organization. They are developing strategy in the language of needs, obstacles, and outcomes, and solutions follow. That makes solutions so much more granular, orders of magnitude more granular. And the solutions are coming from people, as my friend Carl Scotland would say, closest to the problem, might say now closest to the need and the opportunity. We're turning a rollout process into a generative process, ones where ideas are flowing, ideas that people themselves are motivated to implement. That is a massive change compared to the traditional model. How to improve the traditional model, I have very little to say about, because I think it's fundamentally the wrong model. And I find it very kind of doubly ironic when that traditional model is used to implement Agile. If you want to choose the least agile way of implementing Agile, we'll use 1990s style managed change to implement it. You know, and I will have nothing to do with it. I just think it's fundamentally the wrong approach. You've got to find ways to engage people. Otherwise, you end up with you know, a change that just, you know, people feel abused, put upon, and when the thing doesn't work, that just generates cynicism and so on. It generates more pain than it's worth. You know, when people have been through that process more than a few times, they don't want to see any more of it. But if you can find a way to harness the energy of the organization, find ways for people to actually engage in understanding and engaging with the challenges that the organization faces, and begin to articulate how things could be, not from a design point of view, but just how much better things could be, and then start to identify the obstacles in the way of that, and then the outcomes and so on, as I've described already. That's a fundamentally different proposition. And it's not just me saying this. You know, there's a you know, in about the same time frame as Agile arose in the technology world, in the organization development world, a corresponding thing called dialogic organization development has emerged as well. And on the back of that, generative organization development. And this is about organization change that's driven through participation and dialogue and ideas coming from the people themselves. Very different to the old model, like the rollout model, but where you just start with a consultant telling you what's wrong with you and coming up with a solution that will fix what's wrong with you. Still fundamentally the same kind of model. And that just, well, first of all, it never worked, or didn't work often enough, well enough. And it's just too out of kilter with 21st century sensibilities as well. You know, if we want people to be engaged in work, We hire smart people to do smart things. Treating them as though they, giving them no say in how things are going to work is just a ridiculous idea. And we need to do better.
Here.
So an interesting one from Darren, if I can pick that one.
Yeah, just seen it there
Relationship
now.
between projects and organisation. Well, that is again interesting. You may guess I'm not a great fan of certain kinds of projects, but actually organising around certain challenges is an important thing. Now we want our stable structures of organisation, as I mentioned under structuring, to be good models of our environment. So our challenges tend to come to the right places anyway. But even with the best structure, there will be challenges that need their own response. There are challenges that don't fit the model. You've just got to mobilize people from different parts of the organization. Amy Edmondson's book, Teaming, really, really great on this. And actually her book, The Fearless Organization on Psychological Safety, actually covers some of the same ground as well. And that's maybe the better book as well. So maybe either of those Amy Edmondson books. You will, from time to time, need to mobilize people around particular challenges. But all the same kinds of things apply. You need to have the right people involved. Obviously, they need to work out, the strategy that works for them, that also reconciles to the strategies of organization scopes and people around them, and so on. If it doesn't break the model, you've got to think quite carefully about what you want to do as a project, what wants to be a more stable organization. You want, I think, predominantly your organization to be organized around domains, but temporarily organizing around challenges is a necessary thing to do as well, and you ought to get good at it. If it's going to happen, you might as well get good at it. And there are, governance models and things that can help. But I recommend Amy Edmondson or any book on sociocracy as well. Yeah.
Stuff. There's one here from Elle. I assume this pertains to a massive pre-transformation enterprise organization that isn't product-led.
Well, organizing it, well, yes and no. If you've got products that are very good fit for your customer, for your business environment, you've got exactly the right products for that are, the structure of your product portfolio is a very good set of answers to those who, what, when, and where, who, what, where, when questions. Then yes, I agree with you. You won't suffer that structuring problem. Some of those other problems still may well exist. So making sure that, for example, issues and progress are appropriately translated, and that levels above product have the right kind of objectives. They are different from the product objectives, and they help you get to the organization's overall objectives. That still applies. Even the best product organization will have to deal with surprise from time to time, and adapting to change is what we do as agile teams. It's part of what we're used to be able to doing at team level. And what organizations are less good at doing is doing that at higher levels. And the thing about connecting, I didn't go as deep into the theory of trust and trust building, but it is utterly fundamental. You can't long term have a viable organization if you aren't paying attention to trust, if you aren't making sure that what is happening is what you think is happening, that people have all the context that they need, both from a point of view that's designed into how the organization is shaped, so that people are close to the context that they need, but also that people are like walking the floor, having the coffee conversations and all the other conversations that happen outside the delivery process to make sure that we have the context we need to do a great job, the context that we need to make great decisions. And that applies just as much to the C-suite as it does to the people writing code. Yeah, that is fundamental. What we're trying to do is increase the decision-making capacity of the organization. And you won't get resilience, and you won't get self-organization and other things you won't get unless you can find ways to increase the decision-making capacity of your organization. It's like flow, but for information and for decision-making. Some quite a lot of parallels there. But it's a really, really crucial thing.
Great stuff. Thanks, Mike. I don't see any more questions unless any of the team can spot anything. I was just going to ask about one of the things I see constantly, and you see it in different levels of organizations, so not just large global enterprises, is a constant sort of inability to communicate effectively or cascade things effectively. You know, there might be some really good strategic thinking work done, and I've seen that.
Yes.
But then it doesn't cascade and translate, and then therefore we don't, organizations don't achieve what they're setting out to do because people don't know what's really being expected.
Yes. Well, that's a sign. I'm slightly nervous by the cascade term because that implies not enough translation happening.
Well,
that's the absence of those translating and reconciling, and particularly those reconciling activities happening. There's no point one part of the organization saying, "Oh, this is the strategy," and not working out the implications for those groups around them or the groups below them or whatever. It's just utterly pointless. You might as well just put a poster up on the wall saying this is the strategy and leave it at that. It is that pathetic. And you get this right not by having strategy done behind closed doors with just a few people, but an important way to address that problem is actually by having the right people involved in the process in the first place. So making sure that the levels below are at least somewhat represented, arguably well represented, maybe not in terms of large numbers of people, but at least with people that are intimately knowledgeable about what's really happening in those other areas and what their strategies are and what the implications on their strategies will be if we make a change over here. And then you have to work through the implications of that. We've always known that, and yet so many strategies are just a list of aspirational bullet points, which you can take or leave. What's the point? Yeah.
Good show. I think we're okay in the question front. You've admirably answered a whole raft of questions that came through the chat. We've still got a little bit of time, but I'm happy to give some time back.
I want to ask. I always want to ask a quick question. So a lot of information taken over the last 40 or so minutes. So I just wanted to know, what would the next steps be if you wanted to learn a bit more about this approach?
I mentioned leading with outcomes. That's kind of an umbrella name for everything that I've packaged up, shall we say? Not everything I've done, but everything I've packaged up. And I've turned it into 4 training modules: foundation, inside out strategy, outside in strategy, and adaptive organization. The stuff you saw today is drawn from adaptive organization. It's actually the most advanced module. So I kind of thrown you in at the deep end. Last week in London, we did foundation and adaptive organization together, 3 days worth, and it was really great. You can do it online, self-paced, at your own pace. If you go to that keynotes page, you'll find details of that there. There is some public training. You've just missed the event I did in London. I'm doing it in Melbourne, Australia in October, and looking at squeezing one in November, possibly in Manchester.
You mentioned a white paper as well that you did. Is that?
There's a white paper, yes. Everywhere, all at once. So that is digging a bit deeper into the model behind the stuff that I've presented today, and it goes a bit more into how do we do something that comes from the systems world, but engage with it in a way that respects complexity, and actually even makes it all about complexity. We're thinking about the many things going on at once. People and teams with autonomy, lots of relationships that we're dealing with. How do we organize those? How do we have rich conversations about them? How do we deal with multiple levels of organization at the same time, and so on? And it goes back to, again, it goes back to some ideas from the last century and some ones that are much more recent. So that's in the white paper, Everywhere All at Once. Yeah, and you can reach it from the keynotes page.
Yeah, I think Craig just shared it in chat.
Cool.
Great stuff. Thanks, guys. Thanks, Mike. Yeah, I think we're all good. If there's no final questions, I'm happy to start to bring things to a close. I guess just to say thanks, Mike, for the
My
amazing
pleasure.
talk session. Always enjoyed hearing from you. Lots of things to follow up on. We'll share around some of the resources to those who could be here and get some of your content around the membership group. Any other announcements, folks? We'll wrap up. Committee members, anything else we should share? Anything else we should be telling our
I
audience?
think we're good. We're good for now. I'll say just keep posted. We'll probably announce our next event soon.
Yeah.
Next couple of weeks or so. Yeah.
Thanks again for those of you who are still with us. Thanks for the questions. Thanks for your participation and engagement. Hope you enjoyed it, and look out for other sessions for the remainder of the year's programme. If you do have a talk yourself and you've got something you'd love to share with, this community or others, reach out to myself or Ahmad. We have other forums in which we can give you a platform to share your content, your ideas. We're always keen to hear from new speakers. So if you've got something, get in touch, and we'll see if we can, if it aligns well with what we're doing in this particular community, then we're happy to try to arrange a slot with you. So if you've got something, don't be shy, reach out, and we'll help give you a voice. Great stuff. Thanks everyone. Thanks again, Mike.
All right.